It was a beautiful, if blazingly hot, sunny day the morning that the Williams moved into their new house on Mulberry Street. The homes in the area were products of the housing boom of the 50s, their faded white paint covering the shame of the naked concrete block, ubiquitous simple forms that repeated cookie-cutter throughout the street with minor alterations, details, and paint schemes camouflaging their similarities. The neighborhood, though quaint and fairly well maintained, was declining. Values were low in spite of the high-income, expensive lots across the street to the east. At this time, many other young people were investing further out, on the edges of the city where houses were bigger, though oddly the same price per square foot. But gas was cheap, so commutes were acceptable if begrudged, and people were willing to drive out to the extents of Phoenix's bloated sprawl, made possible by the advances of Dwight Eisenhower's highway technology, unaware of the high monetary and personal costs. The Williams, though, were actually drawn to the smaller inner homes, which they saw as an empty template. The price was simply too good to pass up, and the house was nearly perfect for them. But, like most newlyweds, there were a few kinks to work out, mostly in the form of paint, as this was the only resource available to their limited means. The previous owners' personalities were covered up and removed, making way for the Williams' sensibilities. This would be the first step in joining the other residents of the block, many of whom had lived there for decades, each with their own stories and home alterations. The neighborhood had at one time been arid farms and groves, having been settled by early pioneers. The land, of course inhospitable to edible plant life, was irrigated by extensions of the Native American canal system, and tilled by the same families for nearly 100 years. Then, post-World War II mortgage revisions allowed home developers like Del Webb to create financed, affordable subdivisions. Hundreds of single-family homes sprouted amidst the local flood-irrigated groves of fruit trees almost overnight. For a while, life merely occurred for the Williams, with all its day-to-day joys and setbacks. Their first daughter was born a few years later, and the house underwent its first minorly major alteration. The bedroom that had long since been reserved for visiting guests, or friends who had indulged too much over dinner, was repainted and prepped. Overnight, their first daughter became their second, multiplying their expenses and excitement in one fell swoop. The house quickly became stuffed with new equipment, furniture, and, finally, family. Life then progressed again, though now with two new additions who were constantly changing the needs of the house. Around this time, public awareness of green concepts was increasing. Phoenix was becoming increasingly jealous of other cities like Portland and Manhattan, which were labeled as much more sustainable. So, blocks to the south, a new infrastructure park was being created. The city touted it as a historic first step towards a sustainable future in the city, paving a way for a greener tomorrow. To the Williams, all it was another use of tax dollars for something that would likely never be used. Years later, a new addition to their family, their first son, also marked the first necessary addition to the house. Being self-proclaimed admirers and supporters of the arts, they hired an actual architect to design the new wing. Mostly because Mr. Williams' firm was doing particularly well that quarter, but also because the couple had been spending time recently with an architect neighbor of theirs who had been educating them on the importance of good design as an investment both in the community and financially. They wanted to avoid joining the ranks of people who had built so-called bad-ons. The new room was added to the family's home, expanding both their assets and their personal bubbles. In response to other homes on the block which were improving the street quality, this addition created a closer link between house and neighborhood. Meanwhile, just down the street from them, an entire cul-de-sac was inverting itself, creating full green space where the asphalt used to lay, which would be the herald of many future changes in the neighborhood. Mr. Williams, ever the traditionalist, found the idea to be appalling, likening the homeowners to hippies or socialists. It took a few family trips with Mrs. Williams and the children to change his perspective on the issue. And not only did he ultimately recognize the benefits of the community, it also convinced him to invest in their own streetscape, which had gone unchanged for years. This included a graywater upgrade that connected to that ill-advised infrastructure park. Shortly thereafter, their last planned child was born, another daughter whom they had engineered room for in the house. That child was only just walking when the family discovered an unexpected arrival was due, a new addition to the clan that unpredictably ensured there was not enough room in the current house. The Williams, like many other families in similar situations, seriously considered selling their now paid-for home and moving out onto the edge, trading up for larger accommodations. Fortunately for them, the market crashed before they had the chance. For the first time in a generation, house jumping, the tried-and-true method of investing, became invalid. The Williams, happily stranded on their beloved street, instead invested again in their own home, calling upon their architect to design a major addition. Realizing the someday future need to downsize their house, this addition would also double as a rental when need be, mimicking nearby multifamily projects. Another chapter, both for the family and the country, had passed, and the recovery of the market was slow in coming, slower than anyone could have predicted. Politicians pointed fingers, experts tried to explain what had happened, and professionals pondered how to prevent such a thing in the future. And though that future was unclear, one thing was certain: people wouldn't, and couldn't, look at homes the same way again. The city government, in the wake of the financial disaster, began to brainstorm on how to encourage growth and reclamation of city neighborhoods. In an inspired move, Phoenix became surrounded by a greenbelt that preserved natural desert, but more importantly, set up a firm boundary that development could not sprawl into. Almost immediately, and for the first time, land within the city became a hot commodity. The market slowly recovered over the years, and though their house remained roughly the same for some time, the neighborhood was changing around them. Many houses on the street were growing and changing in different ways, a result of their owners and the community's needs. Familiar neighbors were upgrading and retrofitting their homes, trees were being planted everywhere, and as a result, the block was slowly becoming more prestigious than nearby areas. New city infrastructure was put in place, more people were moving into the neighborhood with more diverse backgrounds, and new ways of thinking about commercial spaces altered the family's routine way of living. Each new move was met with stubborn resistance at first, at least until the condition became familiar, after which it became just another part of daily life, which moved along. The children were enrolled in a nearby school with a focus on community, and many days the parents learned just as much from their children as was the other way around. It was, in fact, highly likely that this subtle influence was the reason that Mr. Williams was unconcerned when new live-work-rent commercial structures were erected in the neighborhood. Indeed, in an unexpected move, he decided to relocate the office into one of these units to eliminate commute and spend more time at home. Eventually, the kids grew up and began moving out. Their now large home saw less and less activity, and once crowded spaces lay fallow a majority of the time. It was thus decided, rather than moving out to a smaller home, to split the house in two, and though Mr. Williams was loath to separate himself from many articles he had accumulated within his sprawling castle, he was assured by his loving wife that the split was necessary for financial as well as social reasons. Besides, the practice was becoming more and more common in the area due to rising land values. Many seasons were spent thus, and the Williams had become a fixture in their neighborhood, along with the majority of the homeowners along Mulberry. The street was now unrecognizable from its original form. Buildings had more than doubled, the streets had been transformed into shaded, walkable things, and though cars were still necessary, they were certainly fewer in number. History was to repeat itself as one of their children, now a newlywed herself, bought and moved into the house next door and began expansions of her own, no doubt a habit learned from her parents. But few stories go without at least a little sorrow. Early in their winter, Mrs. Williams fell ill. Friends and family flocked to her side, but despite their care and prayers, she passed away. Mr. Williams found comfort in his children, grandchildren, and lifelong friends. It was the most difficult transition he had ever been forced to endure. Not long thereafter, another Williams family moved back into the house, reconnecting the structure in order to care for the aging Mr. Williams, who wisely but reluctantly agreed to the situation. By the time the elder Williams passed away, property values in the neighborhood had risen to the point that it simply made sense to expand once again for rental purposes. The two lots were joined physically in a symbolic gesture that welcomed yet another set of lives to be lived on the street. This is a story of the Williams on Mulberry Street, but it is also the story of changing neighborhoods across the country. Individual projects don't transform communities, it is the people who change, and in response to both good and bad design decisions, transform their own neighborhoods. And it all starts at home.